Workers died building it. A storm with winds of 100 miles per hour cracked its steel. By 2003, inspectors found that 70% of its gusset plate thickness had corroded away. Oregon's deadliest bridge carries a fracture-critical designation. If one component fails, the entire span comes down. Thousands still cross it every day. And the reason it's not being replaced has nothing to do with engineering. In the late 1990s, as the first steel beams rose over the Willamette River, the Sunset Highway Bridge was already demanding a price in human life. The official record from the Oregon Department of Transportation lists 12 worker deaths during construction. Union archives, however, claim the true toll was closer to 20. Most of these men were drawn from Oregon's logging towns and shipyards, hired on short notice for a project that promised steady pay but offered little in the way of safety. Falls from scaffolding were the most common cause. On a cold morning in March, a crane overturned, pinning a carpenter beneath twisted metal. His name was James Peters Sr. His son, Jim Peters, would later recall in an oral history interview, "If this bridge doesn't fall, I'll die trying to finish it." Those words, spoken the night before the accident, still echo in the Peters family. The loss was not just a line in a state report or a name on a union ledger. It was a father who never came home, a husband whose paychecks stopped arriving, a story replayed in kitchens up and down the valley. Contractors pressed hard to finish on schedule. Deadlines were tight, and every day lost to weather or equipment breakdown brought the threat of penalties. Safety equipment was basic: hard hats, canvas belts, and little else. Laborers worked with lead-based paints and asbestos insulation, often without knowing the risks. In one incident, a scaffolding collapse sent 3 men into the river below. Only one survived. The union's incident logs record names the state never counted, men whose deaths were attributed to non-occupational causes or lost in the paperwork after a 1998 office fire destroyed part of the construction archive. The pressure to finish fast came from the top. State officials saw the bridge as a symbol of modern Oregon, a promise to link rural communities to the rest of the state. But the rush to open the span meant corners were cut. Overtime hours stacked up. Workers took risks to keep the project moving. Families like the Peterses, the Alvarezes, and others paid for that urgency in ways that numbers alone can't show. By the time the last girder was set, the bridge was already carrying a hidden burden. Its age isn't just measured in years, but in the lives lost to build it. The stories from that era, some told, some buried in forgotten files, reveal a vulnerability built into the structure from the very beginning. The bridge would stand, but the cost would linger, waiting to be counted every time someone asks why it's still here, and why those early warnings went unheeded. On a late summer afternoon in 19ZZ, the Willamette Valley braced for what meteorologists would later call a derecho, a rare, punishing windstorm that swept in from the coast with sustained gusts topping 100 miles per hour. The bridge, less than a decade old, became a test site for forces its designers had never truly anticipated. As the gust front hit, the northbound lanes were closed in a rush, but not before the deck began to flex and shudder. Photographs from that day show steel beams bowing under the relentless pressure, and audio recordings captured the groan of metal straining at its limits. Dr. Elaine Cheng, then a young meteorologist with the National Weather Service, remembers the event with clinical clarity. The wind was not just high, it was a sustained pressure system that tested the bridge's design limits in a way no prior testing had anticipated. Her field notes, later published in a technical journal, described micro-cracking in the main girders, hairline fractures invisible to the naked eye but unmistakable under ultrasonic inspection. These cracks, left unrepaired for more than a decade, would become the bridge's silent inheritance from that storm. The first formal inspection after the derecho, conducted in 2003, revealed something far more alarming. ODOT engineers found that several gusset plates, thick steel connectors critical to the bridge's stability, had lost up to 70% of their original thickness to corrosion. A simple tap with a hammer sent flakes of rust tumbling to the ground. The inspection report flagged the bridge as fracture critical, a term that means if one of these components fails, there is no backup to prevent collapse. The bridge's name was entered into a federal list of structures requiring urgent attention, but the recommended reinforcements never came. Dr. Cheng's analysis, paired with the inspection data, turned what had been a hidden vulnerability into a measurable risk. For the first time, the bridge's weaknesses were not just whispered among engineers, they were documented, quantified, and entered into the official record. The technical language of those reports, loss of section, fatigue cracking, fracture critical, became a new kind of warning, one that would echo through every subsequent inspection. Behind the jargon was a simple reality. The bridge was no longer just aging, it was actively deteriorating, and everyone with access to the reports could see it. The next step would come from inside the agency, as internal alarms grew louder and whistleblowers began to escalate their concerns. Mark L. Jensen, a senior bridge inspector at ODOT, spent years raising alarms that rarely left his inbox. In a string of emails obtained through a public records request, Jensen warned that the bridge's load rating calculations could not be trusted. He flagged the lack of a real-time monitoring system, calling it a blind spot in the agency's safety net. Instead of action, Jensen received a formal reprimand for overstepping authority. His warnings, laid out in clear technical language, were quietly filed away. It was not just internal resistance. Over the past 4 decades, every major replacement proposal stalled in the same political gridlock. In 2001, legislators debated a public-private partnership to rebuild the bridge as a toll crossing. The plan failed in the House, with only 45% in favor after intense lobbying by toll operators and construction suppliers. The cycle repeated. Studies were commissioned, costs ballooned, bills were debated, then shelved. Meanwhile, the bridge's fracture-critical status remained unchanged. Knowledge of the risk was never the problem. The real obstacle was a system unable or unwilling to act, even as the economic stakes grew with every passing year. Captain Thomas Reynolds had spent nearly 4 decades guiding tugboats beneath the bridge's shadow. On June 12, 2017, his routine run turned into a disaster. A chunk of concrete, weighing close to 15 kilograms, crashed down from the northbound deck and smashed into his vessel's starboard hull. The impact tore open the side just above the waterline. Seawater surged in, alarms blared, and Reynolds ordered his crew to abandon ship. The port of Astoria halted all cargo traffic for 2 days, while inspectors combed the river for debris. The shutdown cost the port an estimated $2.3 million in lost shipments and dock fees. Reynolds later described the bridge as a hazard that sheds material without warning. He pressed lawmakers to act, but the sense of urgency faded as quickly as the headlines. Years before the accident, engineers had tested a corrosion control system, zinc-rich epoxy coatings and cathodic protection on several steel plates and bearings. Lab results from the University of Oregon showed a 90% reduction in corrosion over a year, and field tests confirmed the effect. Yet by 1999, the pilot was abandoned, dismissed as too costly or unproven. The untreated steel kept rusting and the bridge kept shedding. For Reynolds, the danger was not just theoretical. It was a missed fix that could have prevented a near-fatal night on the river. Sensors capable of detecting strain and microfractures are scheduled for installation across the bridge in 2025, funded by a $200 million federal grant under the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. These devices promise real-time data, but their arrival comes as legal action threatens to stall any major overhaul. An environmental lawsuit filed in mid-2025 claims that the Oregon Department of Transportation's replacement plans ignored critical habitat studies, leaving the project in limbo for at least another year. Meanwhile, director Sarah K. Monroe faces growing scrutiny. Her background as a senior engineer and her campaign contributions of $660,000 from steel and construction interests have drawn questions about her priorities. Monroe insists on a phased, data-driven approach, allocating $35 million for inspections and repairs, less than a third of what full replacement would demand. Yet outside Oregon, a modular steel deck system recently passed a statewide pilot, offering a glimpse of a faster, lower-cost alternative. The decision now hangs between incremental upgrades, mounting legal barriers, and the possibility of a modular leap. Each path carries risk, but the bridge waits, unchanged, as political and technical arguments stretch into another year. Every day, tens of thousands depend on a structure one flaw away from catastrophe. Infrastructure doesn't age gracefully, it erodes in plain sight. Until action matches the risk, Oregon's deadliest bridge stands as a warning. Safety delayed is danger accepted. What would it take to finally tip the balance?